Welcome to Conspiracist.
Great to be here.
Today we're doing a deep dive into a pretty significant hypothesis. The idea that governments have intentionally hidden evidence of a New World Order agenda.
Right. And we've got sources that touch on related concepts, things like global unity, cosmopolitanism, globalization, and of course how that term New World Order itself has been used, both politically and in conspiracy theories.
Exactly. So our aim here is really to objectively look at the claims, the reasoning presented in these sources, and just evaluate the information we have in front of us. No taking sides, just laying out what the materials say.
That's the plan. To examine the philosophical ideas, the real-world trends like globalization, the political rhetoric, and the specific conspiracy claims, and try to understand how they all connect or perhaps disconnect from this central hypothesis.
Okay, let's start maybe with some of those foundational ideas. Concepts like cosmopolitanism and world government often come up. Our sources bring up Immanuel Kant first.
Yes, Kant and his Cosmopoliticum.
Sounds very academic. What's the core idea there for our listeners?
Well, it's basically Kant's concept of cosmopolitan law. He wasn't actually arguing for, say, a single world government. It was more about creating principles for perpetual peace, a kind of universal community.
A universal community? How so?
Through establishing rights that apply everywhere, like the right to universal hospitality, meaning you should be treated peacefully when you go to another land, and the right of resort, the ability to, present yourself elsewhere because we all share the earth.
So it's more about a shared ethical framework than a political structure.
Precisely. It's about peaceful interaction between states and individuals across borders based on universal rights rather than merging everyone under one political banner.
Okay. But others did imagine more concrete forms of world government, didn't they? Our sources mentioned Dante, for instance.
They do? Dante Alighieri, back in the Middle Ages, argued for a universal monarchy. He called it a Respublica Christiana, a Christian republic, basically.
Why did he think that was necessary?
He believed a single, universal, secular authority operating within a, let's say, Christian moral understanding was the only way to guarantee peace and justice globally, keep the different princes and kings from fighting all the time.
Interesting. And there was Vittoria, too.
Yes, Francisco de Vitoria, a bit later. He talked about the Res Publica Tucius Orbis, the republic of the whole world. Again, this idea of universal community, but maybe more focused on being governed by natural law that everyone could recognize.
So these are pretty old ideas, philosophical explorations, really. Did they ever gain, practical momentum?
Well, much later, yes. The sources point to the late 19th and early 20th centuries. You see the rise of actual international organizations, supranational movements starting to form.
And specific people promoting it?
Yeah, quite a few prominent figures, people like Ulysses S. Grant, actually, late in his life. The Chinese reformer Kang Yue, Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i faith, and maybe famously the writer H.G. Wells. They all, in different ways, supported some kind of world government or federation.
And didn't this get a boost after World War II?
Oh, absolutely. A huge surge, actually. World Federalist movements really took off. There's a strong feeling, especially among atomic scientists, the one world or none sentiment. The sheer destructive power unleashed made the idea of nation-states potentially wiping each other out seem, terrifyingly real.
But that momentum didn't last, did it? What slowed it down?
The Cold War, primarily. Our sources highlight that the Soviet Union was deeply suspicious of the whole idea. They tended to view it as a kind of Trojan horse for American imperialism.
So ideological conflict basically shut it down.
Largely, yes. That deep divide between the U.S. and USSR made cooperation on something that fundamentally pretty much impossible. By the early 1950s, the big push for a formal world state had really faded into the background of international politics.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Another huge concept tied into all this is globalization. How do our sources define that, and why is it relevant here?
Globalization, basically, is described as this increasing interdependence. Economies, markets, societies, cultures, they're all getting more and more interconnected across borders.
Driven by what, mainly?
Things like lower trade barriers, money moving more freely, big improvements in transportation, and obviously information technology. The internet, satellites, all that.
And the connection to a New World Order idea. Why might some see globalization in that light?
Well, I think for some observers, this increasing integration, economic, cultural, political, could look like a potential framework, a structure through which a more centralized global agenda, whether it's open or hidden, might operate or emerge. It creates links and dependencies that weren't there before.
But it's definitely not seen positively by everyone. The sources list quite a few criticisms of globalization.
Oh, definitely. It's heavily criticized from various angles. Some see it as basically American dominance, the Washington Consensus, pushing policies that benefit the U.S. and its allies, maybe at the expense of others.
And economic concerns, too.
Big ones. Worries about it increasing inequality, both within countries and between richer and poorer nations.
Yeah.
Environmental impacts are another major criticism. Resource depletion, habitat loss, pollution from increased global trade and production.
What about jobs and workers?
That's a key point, too.
Yeah.
Concerns about exploitation of workers in developing countries, poor working conditions, a race to the bottom as companies look for the cheapest labor.
It sounds like the criticisms go beyond just economics.
They do. There are cultural dimensions. Our sources mention anxieties, especially in places like the Arab and Muslim world, about globalization being a kind of Western cultural invasion, undermining local traditions, values, identities.
And language.
Yes. Language loss is a significant concern, particularly for indigenous communities. This is often linked to, negative mental health effects and a loss of cultural heritage. It fuels the anti-globalization movement. A broad movement, really, critical of corporate-driven globalization, advocating for things like global justice, fair trade, environmental protection, workers' rights. And within that, you also find skepticism towards global governance institutions themselves, the IMF, World Bank, WTO, kind of an anti-global governance sentiment sometimes.
So globalization is this double-edged sword, creates connections, but also a lot of friction and criticism. Now, let's talk about the actual phrase New World Order. Our sources make a distinction between how it's used in politics versus in conspiracy theories. How has it popped up in, say, mainstream politics?
Right, it has been used by world leaders, but often to describe shifts they see happening in international relations, especially after major upheavals. Mikhail Gorbachev, for example.
The Soviet leader.
Yes, in a 1988 UN speech, he talked about his vision for a new world order. He meant things like strengthening the UN, moving away from strict ideology and foreign policy, maybe a single world economy eventually, and importantly, cooperation between the superpowers, less confrontation.
And then George H.W. Bush used it very famously.
He did, in 1990, his Toward a New World Order speech. This was right as the Cold War was ending, during the first Gulf War crisis.
What was his vision? What did he mean by it?
For Bush, it emphasized U.S. leadership, but also partnership, including potentially with the now changing Soviet Union. It was about establishing a system where international law mattered, where aggression, like Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, would be met by collective action, a rule-based order.
How was that received? Did people see it the same way?
Well, the press at the time noted his focus on American strength underpinning the law, the new potential for the UN to actually work because the U.S. and Soviets weren't automatically opposing each other. Yeah. But there were also warnings, about whether this was too reliant on just the personal relationship between Bush and Gorbachev or if it was truly a stable new system.
So in these political contexts, it's more about describing a changed international landscape and maybe aspirations for cooperation.
Generally, yes. Describing a perceived shift, a potential for new rules of the game, often in the wake of major conflicts or geopolitical realignments. Other leaders have used it too, occasionally, like President Ahmadinejad of Iran or President Saakashvili of Georgia, though perhaps with different connotations.
Okay. Now let's contrast that sharply with the New World Order concept as it appears in conspiracy theories. Where does that version come from, according to our sources?
That version has quite different roots. The sources trace it largely back to right-wing populist groups in the U.S. starting around the 1960s.
What were their main fears?
Deep anxieties about losing national sovereignty. A fear of a secret plot to establish a one-world government, often believed to be operating through visible institutions like the United Nations, but actually controlled from behind the scenes.
By whom? Who did they think was pulling the strings?
Often shadowy groups. Corporate internationalists, powerful bankers. Writers like Miriam Davison, for instance, explicitly linked this supposed conspiracy to the creation of the Federal Reserve back in 1913, and later to the Council on Foreign Relations.
And there are darker undertones sometimes mentioned.
And unfortunately, yes. The sources point out that these theories often tap into or are explicitly linked with anti-Semitic tropes, sometimes drawing ideas or structures from infamous forgeries like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, alleging secret Jewish control. It's a recurring element that needs to be acknowledged.
Who else gets woven into these narratives? Any specific historical figures or groups?
Quite a few are often cited. People like Cecil Rhodes, the British imperialist, and his supposed plan for a secret society to guide world events. H.G. Wells gets mentioned not just for his political ideas, but his fiction exploring world states. And figures from New Age or occult traditions like Alice Bailey, who prophesies a coming political and religious New World Order.
Are there contemporary triggers for these fears, too?
Yes, things like proposals for new international reserve currencies, or expanding the role of the IMF's special drawing rights. These often get interpreted as steps towards a single global currency and thus control.
And there's a religious dimension for some groups.
Definitely. Within some Christian right circles and also certain occult beliefs, there's this idea of an ancient conspiracy working towards not just a one-world government, but also a one-world religion, often seen as paving the way for a figure like the Antichrist.
How do critics analyze these kinds of conspiracy theories? The sources mention a couple of terms.
Right, they mentioned the furtive fallacy. That's the assumption that major world events must be the result of secret, hidden plots, rather than, complex, overt forces, or even incompetence or chance.
And fusion paranoia.
That describes the tendency in these theories to kind of bundle together lots of different fears: fear of communism, fear of bankers, fear of the UN, fear of technology, maybe environmental regulations, and fuse them all into one giant interconnected conspiracy, often without solid evidence linking them all.
What about, say, Marxist perspectives? They are often critical of global power structures, too.
They are, but they tend to see the New World Order conspiracy theory itself as misguided. From a Marxist viewpoint, the concentration of global power and capital isn't necessarily a secret plot, but rather the logical, maybe inevitable, highest stage of global capitalism playing out openly, even if its effects are negative.
Finally, let's address some specific claims the sources debunked, particularly concerning the UN.
Okay. A big one is the misrepresentation of UN initiatives like Agenda 21 or the newer 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development.
How are they misrepresented?
Well, conspiracy theories often claim these plans are about things like abolishing private property, forcing people into cities, taking away children, imposing a world government. Our sources state clearly that these claims have no basis in the actual UN documents, which are non-binding frameworks for sustainable development goals like poverty reduction, clean water, etc. The very term UN Agenda 21-2030 doesn't even exist in UN text. It's something created within the conspiracy narrative.
What about claims of UN troops on U.S. soil or disarming Americans?
Yeah, those are persistent claims. Allegations, for instance, that the UN plans to disarm U.S. citizens, or that foreign peacekeepers are training to operate in American cities, like Chicago sometimes comes up. The sources indicate these have been repeatedly investigated and found to be baseless by law enforcement and fact-checkers. There's no evidence for such plots.
Right. So wrapping up this deep dive, we've journeyed through quite a bit, from philosophical ideas about world unity and Kant's cosmopolitan law
to the very real, very complex phenomenon of globalization, with all its drivers and its criticisms.
Then looking at how the specific phrase New World Order has been used by political leaders like Gorbachev and Bush to describe shifts in international politics.
And finally, contrasting that sharply with the conspiracy theory version, with its distinct origins in populist fears, its connections to anti-Semitism, and its focus on secret plots and hidden controllers.
It seems the source material really shows this long history of both aspiring towards global order and, maybe simultaneously, fearing loss of control or hidden agendas, especially during times of big change.
Exactly. There's a clear difference highlighted between the stated, often aspirational political goals, sometimes labeled New World Order, and the largely unsubstantiated, often quite elaborate claims of a secret, malevolent conspiracy driving world events under the same name. Understanding that distinction seems crucial.
A complex picture indeed, based on the information we've reviewed today.
It certainly is. Lots of layers to unpack.
Thanks for listening to Conspiracist.